Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of the 17th Maintenance Cost Conference, the IATA's MCC, as you may know it from the past years. So this is our second episode, and we will be talking about issues in the supply chain and with the OEMs, and we will go also through some of the recent agreements we achieved. So just some logistics information. The session is recorded today. Your microphones are muted. Please use the Q&A feature on the right side of your screen, assume that it's there, to submit your questions. Some of you have submitted your questions earlier. Thanks to those of you. Please click on the submit when you've seen the poll question. We will have one poll question that you will see it on the screen during the second presentation. And please, we'll go with the competition law guidelines. Again, I'm Chris Marku. I'm the head of operational cost management at IATA, in charge of all technical operations and MRO related activities and aircraft leasing. So for those of you who I may have not met before, some of the guidelines, the competition law, it's please do not discuss any issues about pricing or market sharing or how you divide markets or any types of boycotts, and also your specific relations with other industry stakeholders. And in any issue, do not try to influence the independent business decisions of competitors. These are the rules. Of course, it's very difficult to try and talk to people during a webinar when people do not meet face to face, but we need to respect this to the benefit of us and also our own organizations. So in the next two episodes, the next two Wednesdays, same time, we will talk about issues in digital aircraft operations, and in the third episode, and on the fourth episode, we will talk about some more specific issues about operating the fleet in the post-pandemic era. So please use the web link to register to the next episode too. So the agenda today is we'll make a short introduction for our speakers, and then we'll first discuss the Rolls Royce IATA agreement. We'll have first the few words from Rolls Royce that we work together with, and then we'll get a walkthrough through the agreement, and then we'll have the Q&A on that session. And then we'll talk about the implications, the Annus Horribilis that we have this past year or so with COVID. We'll have the poll within the presentation and the final Q&A. And for our speakers of today, first we'll have Rom Chambard, who is the VP of Marketing for Rolls-Royce. He will say a few words in the beginning, followed by my esteemed colleague, Daniel Kanter, that he is in the legal services. He's in charge of antitrust and competition law at IATA. He will get you through the agreement and some of the details. And then in the second part of our webinar today, we will have Dr. Kevin Michaels, who is a managing director with the AeroDynamic Advisory, a very good friend of us in the past. We collaborate in some of their surveys that we do. They are doing great work for the industry, and you may have seen his commentaries in various magazines and other articles. So with this, let's start the first point of the discussion. We'll have the Rolls-Royce view, a few words from Rom. So Rom, it's all yours, and thanks for joining us from the UK this morning. And again, we appreciate all your efforts in this agreement. All yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. So good morning, good afternoon from London today. So what I wanted to do just before, I guess Daniel is taking us through all the points from the agreement, is just give a little bit of context on how we came out to this agreement that we issued a few weeks ago. So in 2019, we actually met with Chris and Daniel and started a series of discussion to try to explore in more details on, I guess, the aftermarket practices from Rolls Royce, but also the specificity of, I guess, the fleets we are serving, which are wide body, large engine, and the differences that there may be compared to the narrow body, namely in terms of maturity of the fleet and on volume, for example, on how this makeup may actually shape the current aftermarket and on some historical, I guess, view of the aftermarket. Then what we did is basically show our strategy on our services, on what our services offerings are, how we bring, I guess, value to our customers, and how we strive to bring more choice and more flexibility in our service offerings, but also in the very fabric of our, MRO network, whether it's our own facilities, which are a Fuse, our joint venture, but also our large number of third-party partners, which are servicing our engine, and how all of this work together with our services. And from this, we basically establish a few key points on our code of practice that you will see in a minute. And basically, for us, really, they are a step on a continuation in our journey to provide choice and flexibility and value to our customers. And they specify, I guess, a few points on a few practices or a few, I guess, clauses that really reflect this philosophy that we are on, this journey we are on. In some respect, the agreement is different to what you may have seen from the CFM agreement. I guess the context is different. This was a voluntary discussion between us and IATA, but also the context is also, I guess, applied to us for the wide body. However, I do think that those principles will apply to many OEMs and hopefully will form the blueprint for future OEM agreements, which I'm sure Daniel will talk about as well. So basically, to summarize, we are delighted to be able to announce jointly with IATA that we have reached, I guess, the publication of this document, highlighting, I guess, key principle of our MRO practices on our aftermarket, with the aim to, I guess, in our language, to improve choice and flexibility and value for our customers. It is to create a pro-competitive market. And this is really the step from our side to show that we have, I guess, aftermarket practices which are compatible with those objectives. So I think Daniel now will take us through, I guess, the specific and a bit of the context from IATA's point of view as well. And then at the end of the presentation, we will be both there to answer any question you have. So thank you very much. And off to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rom. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back, and an even greater pleasure to be here with Rom and to describe the recent agreement that IATA has struck with Rolls Royce. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit of background in terms of what the overall objectives have been for IATA when it comes to this initiative. As many of you know, and now going back roughly about a decade, IATA received some complaints from our members when it comes to the lack of competition and certain practices in the MRO aftermarket. And so we engaged on an initiative to explore what this was about from an industry level, not specific to any particular OEM. Where we are today, I think is in a very good place. As you all know, we entered into a settlement agreement with CFM a few years ago, and this was then followed by this recent announcement between IATA and Rolls Royce in July. And as Rom just noted, the objective, certainly from IATA's point of view, is that these types of principles that you will find both in the CFM as well as in the Rolls joint best practice document when it comes to aftermarket practices. We're hoping that they will be more widely spread across the OEM, both on the engine and on the component side. You will see here in a minute, the overarching principles are non-discriminatory. They are designed to open up competition, both on the labor as well as on the parts. Now, when it comes to the European Commission, they had independently looked into some of these practices, starting in sort of 2014, 2015 timeframe. And as IATA engaged with our members and also with the European Commission, it became clear that the European Commission focused on two OEMs at that time. One was CFM, the other one was Honeywell. And DG Comp at the Commission encouraged IATA to submit formal complaints against both Honeywell and CFM. Eventually, this led, as I mentioned, to the CFM settlement agreement, and then, as I said just a few weeks ago, we struck this additional agreement with Rolls Royce. And I should say at the outset that we are exceedingly pleased with the collaborative nature and really constructive dialogue that we continue to have with Rolls Royce. A bit of fresh air, if you will, as the negotiations that we had with CFM were substantially more contentious. Even though the end result was good, it was a lot more difficult to get there. And I think as a lawyer, it's not always optimal to have external counsel pushing their respective clients in one particular direction. I think the collaborative nature that Rolls-Royce and IATA exhibit over the past 18 or so months have just been exemplary, and we encourage more of that going forward. Next slide, please. So just a few key dates. As I mentioned, back in 2014, we started to engage with the European Commission. The formal complaints against CFM and Honeywell, IATA filed back in 2016, which eventually then led to the bilateral IATA-CFM settlement agreement in March of 2019. And now most recently, on July 1, 2021, we issued the best practice document with Rolls Royce. Next slide, please. It's interesting. When IATA first entered into dialogue with the European Commission, the overall objective of that was to create an industry-wide precedent, if you will, that would apply across the industry and would be equally applicable to each of the engine and component OEMs in the aftermarket. Now, because we entered into a private settlement agreement with CFM, we never never achieved that benefit. And so what we did with the CFM agreement was we extrapolated the pro-competitive principles into a sort of code of conduct, if you will, that could be applied more broadly across the MRO industry. And that's exactly where we started with Rolls Royce, and also where we ended, if you will. And I suspect looking forward and hopefully having a number of additional OEMs signing on to these types of principles, we will be using this code of conduct as a starting point. There may be certain differences depending on the OEM, but the overarching principles should really look the same. And that is the objective of IATA, to really extrapolate and solicit, if you will, these pro-competitive principles across the industry. Next slide, please. So before we get into the meat of the agreement with Rolls Royce, what are the main differences with CFM? Well, of course, as we mentioned, there was no underlying formal complaint against Rolls Royce. And so, as Rom just mentioned, this was a voluntary engagement on Rolls' side, of course, also on IATA's side. But that also meant that the objectives that IATA was trying to accomplish in the CFM agreement, at least on the enforcement side, are quite different. What we did with CFM was, in a way, to mimic a European Commission commitment decision, but in a private settlement agreement. That was not the intention going into these discussions with Rolls Royce. And so the enforcement mechanism, the potential for penalties, are not in the IATA Rolls Royce agreement as they are in the CFM agreement. In terms of scope and duration, as Rom mentioned, this agreement applies to civil large Rolls engines, and at least for now excludes future engine technology developments, though both IATA and Rolls Royce are committed to amending the agreement for any potential future engine types if we jointly decide that makes sense. The initial terms of the agreement is for 5 years, and we will, after those 5 years, decide whether or not the agreement should be retained or amended or rescinded. We have also committed to meeting regularly every quarter to work on improvements, to discuss potential issues that have come up, and just make sure that the excellent relationship that we've established between the two parties continue going forward. Next slide, please. So on the following 2 slides, I've listed the main principles that you will find in the agreement. I personally think that both from a legal and a practical point of view, especially a practical point of view, the document that we put together is a lot easier to digest than the CFM agreement. Even though many of the principles are the same, it's a simplified document and it should be easier to understand. So if we just go from the top, Rolls will not prevent the development of legitimate non-OEM parts or non-OEM repairs by MRO providers and independent parts manufacturers. So this is a foundational provision in the agreement, which means that independent MROs should be able to compete on equal footing with Rolls, and PMA manufacturers and those that engage in DER repairs, for example, should be able to start the approval and certification process as well, if they so choose. Rolls will not prohibit the use of non-OEM parts or repairs. And again, the exception to this, and you'll find this in the CFM agreement as well, is if a particular engine is on a risk transfer agreement, total care, or as it is called in the Rolls world. Moving on, Rolls will not require any third-party MRO shops to remove non-OEM parts from Rolls engines brought in for service under a Rolls license. Similarly, Rolls will not deny warranty coverage of the OEM components and repairs on Rolls engines based solely on the presence of non-OEM parts or repairs. So there'll be an underlying analysis if there is a dispute. But the presence of non-OEM parts or repairs alone will not result in the denial of warranty coverage. Next slide, please, Geraldine. I think you missed, if we can go back one slide. Perhaps we are missing a slide. I'm sorry about that. There are 3 additional points that I'd like to make, and that is that Rolls will sell all OEM parts and perform all part repairs and provide technical support irrespective of the presence of non-OEM parts or repairs in the engine. And moreover, Rolls will provide access to engine maintenance pursuant to instructions for continued airworthiness, as well as technical supports to its airline customers and their approved MRO providers. And then lastly, we had some discussions regarding used serviceable material. This is something that I think pertains to all of our ESG considerations and the extent to which used serviceable material can be used more broadly, both on the OEM side, but also on the MRO independent side would be very, very beneficial as well, and something that that Rolls encourages as well. That was all in terms of going through the main principles of the agreement. As Rom mentioned, we're happy to take any questions from the audience. And maybe Chris, back over to you.
Thank you both for the presentation. And please type in any questions you may have for our panelists today, for Rom and Daniel. I have a question for maybe for Rom, but also Daniel can chip in. It's about the measurement of success of this agreement. How do you see, maybe Rom, from your side specifically, how do we say that this agreement is working and is succeeding into the industry as people are trying to go through it and understand what it means, and as they start getting into maybe repairs or setting up a business of an independent shop or whatever, or they are already a shop that they are trying to get a stronger position in the market. So what do you think would be the measurement of success of this agreement? If you can elaborate.
Yes, thanks you, Chris. So that's a very good question. I think ultimately the success measure will be for why it makes sense for third party to come on offer their services, whether it is MRO repair, full I guess MRO capability, DER, for example, or alternative services than the OEM. The reason I say where appropriate is because I guess the wide body is a smaller fleet than obviously some of the narrow body fleets. But also within this, there are some difference between engine types. So some engines will be fairly early in their life cycle, or maybe the value transfer that long-term service agreement provide is still what the customer favor. But also some fleets are fairly small when you have only, like, for example, 200 aircraft, like 400 engines. And in that case, it may not be the most, a big enough market for a third party to really come and provide some, competition. What we've done, obviously, with this agreement is providing the environment for those competitors to come on thrive. But obviously, whether they come will depend on the business opportunity they see. So I think the success measure is probably for some of the larger fleets, like, for example, the Trent 700, to see more, I guess, third party coming, as I said, on competing on those areas. Is something we have already started to see, but obviously we expect more, and we would like those, I guess, principle to show the direction of travel on the willingness, obviously, for this to develop. In terms of a success measure, this is obviously quite qualitative. So in terms of quantitative, what we are doing is we are looking at the proportion of our fleet on the various, I guess, model for their MRO services. So the proportion of long-term service agreements with the OEM, so with us, the proportion that maybe takes some more pay-per event service that we may offer, and then the proportion that will go to the open market, whether it is T&M show visit, DR repair, or even using residual life on some of the engines.
Okay, thank you, Rom. We have a question. And I think this is for Daniel. What happened to the claim regarding Honeywell? Is there some progress into that? I don't know, Daniel, if you would like to take that on.
Yeah, no, so thank you, Chris. And of course, Honeywell was one of the two companies where IATA filed formal complaints in Brussels back in 2016. The objective from IATA's point of view is to engage in similar discussions as we have now had with both CFM and most recently with Rolls Royce, also with Honeywell. So we're really hopeful that we will strike a similar agreement with Honeywell, as well as with other both engine and component OEMs in the marketplace. It takes time to strike these types of agreements, as Rom can attest to. Even though our the relationship between Rolls and IATA was always excellent and continues to be so, getting the nitty-gritty right, that both companies, from the perspective of the OEM as well as IATA and our members, it takes time to get it right. And so it's a long-term initiative that is we're looking years into the future in terms of engaging with Honeywell and several others, as that's certainly what we plan on doing, and we're hoping that that Honeywell as well as others will reciprocate and invite IATA to the table and do so in a constructive and meaningful way.
Thank you, Daniel. I think I'll go back to Rom with the next question. And also, please note, I think the agreement is on the IATA website, just for your information. If you type iata.org/MCTG, and then you go to the agreements tab, please, you will find it and download it from there. And also it's on the chat box. I think all of you should have access to it. So Rom, back to you. And this question is about the engine mainly the engine OEM business model. As you know, and many people have said that when you provide the aircraft to your customers, to the operators, the engines are provided at very low cost, and the business model is that you get a lot of your investments as the engine operates through time and goes through maintenance events and things like that. Do you see, with the recent changes in the financial world, with the pandemic, with COVID, do you expect, even if I can throw in myself as the sustainability, the environment aspect, do you see that there will be a change in that model? And it's not only for Rolls Royce, of course, you talk about Rolls Royce, but is there you see any changes in that OEM business model?
Yes, so I guess the business model is a fine balance between the acquisition price of the engine, as part of the aircraft acquisition, the maintenance throughout the life, or I guess with the initial operator, and then towards the end of the life. And obviously, they all need to be balanced because there is various needs. There is obviously the acquisition price, which I guess we try to keep as low as possible for the airlines. There's a cost of maintenance that needs to be competitive, and obviously there is all the residual value towards the end on reusing parts of the engine on another aircraft, and so forth. There's obviously also the need for the OEM to recoup some of our R&D costs and obviously make the business case, because I guess that's the way we finance the next generation of engines as well, and on R&D on future system as well. So this is obviously a quite complex equilibrium, and I guess whatever we do needs to be holistic. So we can't just take value away from one part and not put it back another way, because otherwise, I guess it doesn't work properly. So what we are doing, obviously, is we are trying to get the best we give our customers with new product. We're offering, and this is across the OEM, I guess, value transfer program, I guess various degrees depending on the OEM. And then obviously in the aftermarket, we are trying to make sure there's a competitive environment on the way to reuse some of the material, both from an economical point of view, but as you just mentioned, from an environmental point of view, to avoid wastage. So with, I guess, future generation of engines, there may be an opportunity to change the ratio of acquisition cost versus cost of maintenance, during the life. And I guess, the two extreme are you get the engine for free and you pay, I guess, a higher maintenance throughout the life, or conversely, you pay the engine, or the acquisition price is higher, but then you get very low cost of maintenance throughout the life. And I think as an industry is where we need to reflect on what serves us best, because there is pro and cons for both. If the engine is unaffordable, we can't finance it from the get-go. But obviously, every party needs to make their business case work as well. In terms of specifically sustainability in the context we mentioned, obviously a large amount of the engine can be reused on just inspected. There's also obviously the ability to repair the parts. There's an economical argument of repairing the part or sometimes fitting new. There's obviously an environmental impact, but I think we can't generalize necessarily too much on this, because some of the repair can be quite involved in terms of the process and the chemical use, and not be too far off actually producing a new parts. But there are some time where it makes a lot of sense, especially on the bigger structure, on the more expensive parts, where a small repair can go a long way. So I think once again, as an industry, we have a duty to maximize most opportunity to reduce our footprint, whatever it is, whether it's on raw material or energy or chemicals.
Thank you, Rom, for the answer. We'll go to the next question. I think, Daniel, I'll throw that to you, but also Rame can chip in, and I can also provide some input. What is the position of the aviation regulators on the use of non-OEM components that are used in critical systems?
Yeah, so I think are you referring to LLPs, Chris, or more generally what the regulatory position is when it comes to, for example, PMA parts and DR repairs?
I think maybe PMA parts, but for critical components. So some of it can be LLPs or not, depending some on how they are called. But it's about the critical items that are called as they are called by certain OEMs. So it's a general kind of question.
Yeah, so certainly from a FAA and EASA point of view, there's no differentiation between a PMA part that pertains to something that is critical or non-critical in the engine or elsewhere. If it is approved and obtains the requisite certifications from the regulator, then it is designed and approved from a regulatory perspective to be the equivalent, if you will, of the OEM part. Not too dissimilar from how a generic drug in the pharmaceutical industry is the effective equivalent, or at least as safe as the branded product. It's the same calculus from FAA and EASA. It all boils down to safety, and the test is that the PMA part needs to be at least as safe as that original OEM part. I don't know, Rom, if you have any additional points of view from the perspective of the OEM in this matter.
Yeah, well, the evidence to have to be presented to the airworthiness authority will be the same in terms of what test has been done, what simulation, all of this kind of stuff. Personally, I think some of the parts, especially safety critical parts, it will take quite a lot, I think, for like a non-OEM or not the original OEM to actually manage to provide, I guess, all the information, because I can't see how, some of it is like detailed knowledge of the design of the engine, which you can't necessarily reverse engineer. Having said this, so for this, I'm talking more about like rotating part, like, a disc or a shaft or something like this. Having said this, it's not unheard of that one of the OEM doing HP turbine blade for one, for their own product can actually do HP turbine blade for another product, and they have the pedigree, obviously, to do this. But obviously, the evidence that needs to be provided, there is no difference between the two. It's just, I think, for some of the parts where it's intimately in the engine on safety critical parts, I'm not quite sure how you can reverse engineer some of it. So I think that's why generally you will see most of the PMA being non-critical parts, where it's I guess easier on a more generic design can fulfill the requirement.
Yeah, thank you both for the answer. I think you pretty much covered it. I just wanted to add that in the past, aviation regulators have approved the use of non-OEM components in critical systems. The question is, will there be time and the investment required on someone to get in a long journey to certify these non-OEM critical components. So it is a question of the ability and the possibility of being able to recover your investment as you as the engine or the parts are used in the future. So it's a very good question. However, it's there's a process by the regulators that they will follow. So if they meet the requirements, I'm pretty sure that these parts can be approved. We have one other question, and I think it's more for Daniel at this point. Is there a timeline that IATA looks at it in terms of engaging with other OEMs to adapt similar pro-competitive policies as found in the CFM agreement? So this is for you, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a tough question to give an accurate answer to. I guess that there's no set timeline in terms of when this initiative is supposed to end. We are going to take our time in engaging with any and all OEMs that have an interest in engaging with us, and whether that is Honeywell or anyone else. We're going to take our time to get it right, not only for IATA and our members, but also make sure that it's mutually beneficial to the party that we have on the other side of the negotiations. As I said earlier, these are in many ways complex negotiations, and the very nature of the negotiations will require quite a substantial amount of time to be taken to again get things right. So we're probably looking at 2 to 4 years down the line in terms of engagement with at least the main OEMs that we have in mind.
Thank you, Daniel. And one more question, I think, Daniel, again, it's for you. Is there also a similar discussion from IATA involving aircraft lessors to accept an airline's implementation of key principles from the IATA Rolls Royce best practice document?
Yeah, that's an excellent question.
The leasing community, as we discussed. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's not anything that is specifically addressed, neither in the CFM agreement or in the more recent Rolls agreement. Now, IATA is of the view that there may be some educational campaign, not only towards the lessors themselves, but also towards the airlines. From the perspective of the lessor, their main concern is to retain the value of the aircraft or the engine throughout its life cycle, and a lot of that is going to depend on what their airline customers believe is the actual value. And so there have been discussions that between IATA and leasing companies pertaining to, for example, non-critical parts when it comes to non-OEM, that they should sort of, for example, inside of the cabin, if there's a PMA part in the cabin, that really ought not affect safety, nor should it have any implications in terms of that residual value. But it is a conversation that, again, it's not an easy one, but we are trying to encourage not only the airline community, but also the leasing community to be more open when it comes to the acceptance of PMA parts and DER repairs, and we're working towards that in parallel with these negotiations that we're having with the OEMs.
Thank you, Daniel. Rom, you want to add anything to this, or just some closing remarks as we are approaching the end of this session?
Not specifically on this question. I think I saw the question of the audience saying, is it available on the website? So obviously, some of our audience may not have read it. They will have seen, obviously, the summary today, or maybe take some time to digest it and I guess just reflect on what it means, I guess, going forward. I think it is useful to actually reiterate the points that we made, mainly about the DR, the PMA, on the fact that basically there would be no discrimination, basically based on those criteria, which is a gist of the agreement. And I guess reiterate that the intent is to continue to offer choice and flexibility and basically provide a competitive environment for the value of the airline, and also I guess for us to give us the opportunity to compete for the services on the MRO throughout the life cycle. So I think it was a good discussion, a good number of questions today, and I think the audience will have seen from the tone on our discussion today with Daniel that on Chris, obviously how those principles came to friction and actually on I guess a voluntary basis, as I said before, and hopefully we can see other people following suit.
Thank you, Rom. And before I'll turn it actually over to Daniel for closing remarks, but there is one last question, Daniel, that I would like to ask you from the audience. Were there any complaints after the IATA CFM agreement was contacted? So maybe you can take that as the last question, and also any closing remarks from your end. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chris, and thank you, Rom, for participating today in this joint presentation. Just rewinding, I suppose. So to date, and in the 2.5 years that the CFM agreement has been in effect, we have not had any formal arbitration proceedings that have gone all the way to the CFM liaison officer and through our arbitration to get to an actual decision. Everything that has been brought to life has been resolved amicably prior to that. And I should say that just like we have a very good relationship with Rom and his team, the same is true between IATA and now the CFM liaison officer, Jean-Marc Demergue, and the independent trustee, Tom Hahn. We regularly catch up every 6 months or so, and we recently received a report from the independent trustee, and again, it verifies that there haven't been any major issues that have come up. There have been some issues that have been resolved to the satisfaction of the airline customer, and we're happy to see that continues to be the result of the agreement. Of course, if there are any issues from the airline side when it comes to CFM or any other OEM, we encourage airlines to reach out directly to myself or to Chris, and we'll see what we can do in terms of helping you with your questions.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you for participating into this. And please, I think you have the emails for all of us, our speakers, and the IATA staff. So feel free to send us any questions you may have, and we'll be more than happy to attend and provide you with an answer. So again, if we were in person, we'll give you a good applause for presenting the agreement and answering the questions. So thank you again. So with this, we'll turn to our next speaker, Dr. Kevin Michaels. He's the Managing Director for a consultancy, AeroDynamic Advisory. Kevin has been in the business for a number of years. He has done excellent, great presentations and commentaries in various articles, and he'll talk to us about this period, the Annus Horribilis, as he calls it. All yours, Kevin, and thanks for being with us today. I think you are muted, Kevin. We cannot hear you. There's some audio issue.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so I will go without the headphones. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Chris asked me to talk to you today about what's going on in the manufacturing supply chain. So it's a different subject. We're not going to talk so much about maintenance today, although I consult a lot in maintenance and MRO. But today I wanted to talk to you about what's happening on the manufacturing side of things. I'll touch a little bit on what's happening in aftermarket strategies of OEMs and what this can mean also. And but what I call this Annus Horribilis, this terrible year that we've been through, and wanted to talk about what this means for the outlook for aerospace manufacturing, and importantly, what it means for the supply chain and how that can actually ultimately affect all of you in customer support, engineering, and maintenance. Next slide. So, a year of disaster and misfortune, that's the definition. Next slide. So, as I'm going to share with you kind of what we think about production and what the outlook is, I think it's important to give you our underlying assumptions about air travel growth and the recovery from this crisis. And I know you've probably seen many of these in recent months from various webinars about recovery, and IATA, of course, does this itself. And you know, my firm, AeroDynamic Advisory, we, last year when the crisis hit, we did very kind of in-depth modeling for about 20 clients of all different types, MROs, OEMs, suppliers, as to how the crisis could unfold and when air travel would recover and what that would mean. And we came out with our forecast last April, in April 2020, that suggested late 2023, which was very, very pessimistic at the time. We've stuck with this, and in terms of when global RPKs recover to pre-COVID levels. And we have updated the forecast recently, which actually pushes it back slightly as a result. And it's really driven by the Delta variant, as well as the lack of global standards when it comes to travel. And I know this is something that IATA is working very hard on today. So basically, as we see it, the recovery has been delayed somewhat because of the Delta variant and what that means. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Delta variant on average infects 8 other people, whereas the Alpha variant, which was the dominant strain, affects 2 other people. So this has resulted in new lockdowns. Next slide. And as we look at the global community and we look at vaccines, well, if you're in certain countries in Western Europe or in the US, you look around and you say, boy, it looks like the vaccines are rolling out well. What's the big issue? Even though there's inevitably anti-vax movements in both regions today. But the issue really is the rest of the world. And what I'm showing you here is, as of August, how much of the world have been vaccinated. And the red are those areas where you haven't seen vaccines, get into people's arms yet. And this is what concerns us. And it's not just that this disrupts international travel, but it also lays the groundwork for more variants to develop. And of course, the way this COVID virus operates as an RNA virus, it mutates very quickly. So that's what we're learning now, with this new variant, and there will undoubtedly be other variants. But, there is some good news out there. The global vaccine production capacity for next year looks like it's about 15 billion doses globally. So that's good news. That should be enough to get the planet vaccinated. However, the mRNA vaccines, which are really the most effective of the bunch, and this is the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, this is only 1/3 of the total. So for those who got the Sinopharm vaccine, it's not as effective against the Delta variant. So there's going to be a lot of work to do, in the months ahead. But it does look like we're starting to see some momentum pick up in some places. I just heard an anecdote that in India, in one day, there were over 20 million vaccines, received by Indian citizens. Next page. So as we look at air travel recovery, I've talked in generality, but of course, I think as all of you know, we need to really separate inter-region and intra-region. So domestic really versus international, and they've really been at two speeds. And domestic RPKs, domestic China, domestic US, other areas, of course, are recovering much faster. And that's why we've seen single aisles, that's why we've seen single aisle production rates, and Airbus talk about increasing rates, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But of course, as we all know, internationally, that's where the real trouble has been, in all of this, and it's going to just take much longer to recover to pre-COVID levels, which has interesting ramifications for the mix of aircraft that will be produced in the years ahead. Next slide. So, one of the big debates in the air travel recovery is business travel. And if you think about it, roughly 30% of all trips are business trips, and roughly 70% are leisure trips. And I think most of us would probably agree that, hey, when the world gets vaccinated, leisure travel is going to come back. There's a lot of pent-up demand. There's a lot of bucket lists that are unfulfilled. A lot of people that want to go out and travel, myself included, and that's going to come back. So I don't know that there's much debate about that. It really seems to me that the big debate right now is around business travel. And in business travel, whilst being maybe 1/3 of the trips or 30%, for many airlines and many of you on this call, it could be half or more of your profits. For some airlines, nearly all of their profits. So we care about what happens here greatly. And so I wanted to show two viewpoints here. And you have kind of the technology community out there, is exemplified by Bill Gates, which are saying, well, as a result of this crisis and the acceleration of calls like we're on right now with Zoom and Teams and other platforms, that business travel will be structurally reduced forever. And Bill Gates says, over 50% of business travel and over 30% of days in the office will go away. Of course, Bill Gates has a lot to gain from this. And I thought Ed Bastian's response to this was pretty brilliant, and said, Mr. Gates is a brilliant man. He's not a business traveler. He hasn't been on the road in a long time. Business travel's done in the trenches. In other words, he's been flying around on business jets, but not out really gaining sales. So the question is, who's right in this debate? And we have an IATA poll for you here. We'd like your opinion on this. So if we could go to that polling question, who is right about the future of business travel? Is it Mr. Gates that says that we will see a substantial structural reduction in business travel? Or is Mr. Bastian closer to the truth, where he says, nope, business travel is going to come back and we should not see a significant reduction in business travel? So if you could get your votes in, we're going to take about 20 more seconds here and allow you to vote on this as to who you think is correct. And I must say, whilst we're voting here, within business travel, it's hard to get really good data on the purpose of business trips, But from the results and the analysis I've seen, about 30 to 35% of business travel is intra-company travel. So it's travel within a company or within an organization. It could be your quarterly sales meeting. It could be employee training. It could be employees that are commuting. Whereas about 2/3 of travel, business travel, is market and customer facing. So it's kind of an interesting way to cut this. So could we get to the results? Of the poll? Oh, interesting. So 70% agree with Ed Bastian, 30% agree with Bill Gates on this. And if our opinion at AeroDynamic Advisory, which I'll share with you, is that we think that that the intercompany travel within business trips could see a structural change. Again, that's about 30% of the trips that are intracompany, and we think that there will be a marginal reduction in that. But it does have an impact on the economics of certain flights. If you're only going to have 15 full fare business class passengers on a transatlantic flight, let's say, versus 20, it might increase the incentive to down gauge. So I think we're kind of somewhere in between the two of these. Okay, next slide. So a Global Business Travel Association poll, and for those of you who aren't tracking this, they do. This is a global organization of travel organizations within companies and those affiliated with the travel industry. This is a poll they recently completed on what they expect. I think there were 700 participants in this, and they have a good website, and the results are fairly transparent. It's certainly worth tracking. But most companies expect post-COVID travel budgets to shrink somewhat, in fact, over half on this. Next slide. Now, one of the great, as we're getting ready to talk about production, one of the great bright spots, of course, has been air cargo and IATA. Of course, you've documented this very clearly. I'm actually showing your data and your forecasts here, but it's pretty stunning what's happened on the air cargo side. And we have a little bit over 2,000 freighter aircraft. They're operating at 10 to 20% higher levels of utilization than before the crisis. I think the interesting message here is that air cargo demand actually has accelerated through the COVID crisis. And this isn't about belly capacity and freighters therefore being busy. This is about air cargo demand. How much demand is there? And with e-commerce accelerated 5 to 10 years, it turns out that the way that these e-commerce e-tailers prefer to move their goods and operate their supply chains is they prefer to move things in modes that favor air cargo over slower modes. So we're seeing a slight shift from maritime transportation to air cargo. And some of this is structural. It's not just that, the maritime transportation sector has been a mess lately. That's part of it. But there's actually very compelling evidence that we're going to be in a period of growth in air cargo for the foreseeable future as a result of the acceleration of e-commerce. And air cargo accounted for 30% of airline revenue in 2020, from 12% in 2019. So it was definitely a bright spot. And for those of you, as this is a maintenance cost conference, I think you'll know that the air cargo maintenance actually kept a lot of MROs alive last year. Not only on heavy checks, but on engines like the CF680C2, PW4000. It was a real nice bright spot. Next page. So given this outlook that we're talking about, air travel not recovering till late 2023, maybe early 2024, what I'm showing you is the production forecast, for air transport. And this is not the delivery forecast, this is the production forecast. And we built almost 1,900 jetliners and turboprops in 2019 before the crisis. And of course, some of these were those Maxes that were built but not delivered, you know, roughly the 400. So as we look at production, and I'm talking production here because I'm going to talk about the supply chain, and to you, the operators, deliveries matter, but to the supply chain, it's actually production that matters. That's what drives business for aircraft suppliers. So we foresee, you know, we had 829 deliveries last year, a cut by more than half, unprecedented, you know, going back to the early 70s when we saw some reductions along this line. It's been a long, long time since we've seen this. And by the way, for Airbus, this is the first substantial cut in production in the entire history of Airbus, going back to the early 70s. You just haven't seen it. We foresee this year that creeping up to a little bit over 1,000 deliveries. And then what you may notice here is we don't show the aggregate total getting back to pre-COVID levels over the next 5 years. Single aisles in the dark blue will recover, we think, to pre-COVID production levels, but that'll be out around 2024, 2025. We do see a shift away from twin aisles, probably no surprise to you on the phone. Difficult news for Rolls Royce, of course, but as a result of the slowness of international travel returning. Next page. So, you know, in our view, Boeing needs to launch a new aircraft, a smaller version of the NMA. You know, given what we just talked about a minute ago with business aviation travel being where we believe there will be some reduction, not a huge reduction, but there are significant headwinds. I think if anything, if Boeing were to revisit the whole NMA decision today, that they would make a smaller version of that aircraft. They were talking 220 to 270 seats before. By all accounts, that's what they were planning on doing, a twin aisle. And they, of course, put that on hold and they're reevaluating. But if you look at the backlog numbers, and, you know, these numbers are a little bit old, they're about a year old. And I'll tell you that, you know, in this crisis, we've seen 675 MAX orders go away. And most of these were by lessors. But this phenomenon, if you look at the 200 seat, this is real. You know, the 5-to-1 backlog advantage that Airbus has over Boeing, that needs to be addressed. You know, between the Max, you know, between the Max 10 and the 7878. We believe a smaller version is required. However, the dilemma is, and I know no surprise to you, Boeing has over $40 billion of net debt on its balance sheet, and it continues to accelerate. So Boeing very much needs to launch a new aircraft. The question is, will it launch a new aircraft? I think the odds of Boeing doing this have decreased, certainly in the last 6 months. And Boeing may well try to, you know, ride this out. I also find it interesting that CFM had this highly publicized press conference in June to talk about their RISE technology, the you know, the open rotor being ready in 2035. To me and to many observers of the industry, this was a message by CFM to Boeing, which is, hey, don't do an NMA or a new aircraft now. You know, stay with the Max and wait for this new technology to come in around 2035, and this will give you your 15 to 20% step change in production technology. So it's an interesting trade-off, and it's almost where the engine company is trying to lead the aircraft OEM in its product strategy. So, so it's still undecided. The fact that Mr. Calhoun has extended his CEO term by 5 years may well be that he wants to get this launched, you know, before his term ends. Stay tuned on this, but I think the odds have probably fallen under 50% of Boeing doing something in the next couple of years. Next slide. You know, a big wild card this year, and I know we're all focused here primarily on Airbus and Boeing, but it's COMAC, and COMAC is, by all accounts, it looks like they may be making their first delivery of the C919 this year. And you know, this year is the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party of China. Seems like a fitting year to do it. And in recent press accounts, it looks like they may be getting ready for their first delivery. this year. And as, again, this is a maintenance group here, you'll appreciate this. I mean, having been around this industry for 35 years and consulted with most of the OEMs, you know, it's my belief that the biggest entry barrier for a new aircraft OEM isn't the technology, it isn't producing the aircraft or designing the aircraft or rolling it off the production line. It's designed for reliability and customer support. I mean, that's what this is about. You're selling productivity, 24/7 customer support. That is the biggest entry barrier. And I believe this is what China will come up against as it rolls out the C919. So we may get a few of these rolled out this year, but let's keep an eye on the dispatch reliability. And I think why this is important is, one of the questions is could China now substitute the C919 for Boeing or Airbus aircraft, you know, and move the West out? It's my contention that they cannot, because it will take years and years and years for COMAC to figure this out. And I think, you know, the C919 will ultimately have those dispatch reliability issues that'll affect its residual value, and it'll affect the willingness of Chinese operators to bring it in wholesale, to depend on it completely. So I think they'll continue to operate the Airbus and Boeing and order the Airbus and Boeing while they see how this aircraft does. So all eyes should be on dispatch reliability of C919. And I think I'm reminded of just the cautionary tale of what happened with the Sukhoi Superjet, which had managed to get orders from Western customers. But after a few years, you know, Interjet of Mexico, for example, the aircraft are being pushed out of the fleet and returned because they couldn't meet dispatch reliability goals. They couldn't get the rotables and service parts out to customers when they need them. Next slide. So what about the supply chain? And you know, this is what Chris asked me to touch on a little bit. And you know, in the world of manufacturing, if you look at supply chain strategies of Boeing and Airbus, it's really been characterized over the last 10 years of vertical integration, because they had pretty much an uninterrupted 2-decade period of continual increases in production rates. And they looked around at many of the OEMs that you deal with, you know, the tier 1 OEMs, the component and system companies, the engine OEMs, and Boeing and Airbus said, well, why are they making so much more money than us when we're taking all the risk? And so they really started going after their profit pools, you know, which is mostly about the aftermarket. And now that we've had this crisis, and now that production rates have been cut in half, and you know, Boeing in particular has racked up these huge losses, they're thinking about it differently. So Airbus terminated plans to vertically integrate on the A320neo geared turbofan nacelle. They were going to make this themselves and offer it as a buyer furnished equipment item. You know, Rolls Royce, who spoke earlier, you know, they're selling assets right now. You know, their balance sheet is really challenged right now. ITP Aero is one of the assets they're selling, but they're looking across the enterprise. Arguably, Rolls Royce was the most vertically integrated of all the engine OEMs, and they've got to find that right balance in a challenging time now, where we're not going to have big sales of twin aisle aircraft certainly for the short to medium term. And Bombardier, you know, sold Short Brothers to Spirit Aerosystems. This was their aerostructures internal capability, and Bombardier decided, hey, rather than being vertically integrated on this and trying to sell it to other OEMs, let's put it in the hands of a tier 1 Spirit, which sells to everyone. All eyes are on Boeing, I think, here as well, and they vertically integrated in a number of different areas, places like APUs, a joint venture with Safran, actuation, which is a market that is oversupplied right now. You probably have too many suppliers, so it's very unclear how Boeing's going to create value here, and in some other areas. So that's all being reconsidered. Boeing hasn't been public about what their plans are, but you can bet that Boeing, given its tight capital now, is better off putting that capital into a new aircraft than it is into vertical integration. Next page. You know, a few words on what's happening in the supply chain, which Chris asked me to touch on. You know, what about the tier 1s? And for those of you who aren't familiar in the manufacturing world, tier 1s are the major aerostructures companies like Spirit and GKN, but they're also the major aircraft equipment companies. So think about the Thaleses and Honeywells and Collinses and Parkers and Eatons and Meggetts of the world. Those are the tier ones. In here, you know, we're going to see the tier ones purge underperforming assets, just like the OEMs. You know, avionics and systems OEMs are the least vulnerable. For avionics and system OEMs, they have a wide variety of revenue sources. They do a lot of work in the military and with business aviation. So even though we see this big downturn in air transport, they can make it through. They have a variety of revenue streams. At the other end of the extreme is aerostructures and interiors. They are the most vulnerable. And by the way, a lot of these companies don't have aftermarket. If you're an aerostructure supplier, you really don't have access to aftermarket revenue streams, so that's tough. We think that cash-rich tier ones and holding companies, as well as private equity, will be active in M&A. Of course, the recent big news is Parker's bid for Meggetts. And by all accounts, just I think yesterday or the day before, the Meggetts shareholders voted in favor of that. You know, Eaton recently announced a big acquisition as well. And so I think we'll see those types of M&A activities continue to unfold. But the bottom line is, I think, just trying to get big for, you know, revenue sake, I think those days are over. A lot of companies were just pursuing some certain size before the COVID crisis, and I think they're going to be a lot more thoughtful about where they, you know, where they choose to engage in M&A. Next slide. So you know, as we go to the sub tiers, that's where the real concern is. Tier twos are component OEMs and sub-assembly providers. We're going to see some attrition here, especially in aerostructures. Tier threes are build-to-print suppliers. So these are suppliers, we call them machine shops, you know, and they don't have the design IP. They're not people that you, the airlines, would ever interface with, but they're in the background and they're making a lot of the parts that you use on your aircraft. And there are thousands of these across the world. This is where we are very, very concerned with attrition. A lot of these suppliers are challenged by working capital. They burned down their working capital. They're out of covenants with their lenders, you know, and they may be asked to ramp up production, which is going to be even more challenging for them. Government aid programs have had a big impact on which suppliers survive. I'd say Europe's actually done a very effective job at keeping their tier threes intact and alive in that Airbus ecosystem. In the US, you know, it depends on what part of the country you're in and how much you depend on Boeing revenue. But in places like Middle America, you know, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, a lot of suppliers are really struggling here. But we've seen a surprising small number of failures thus far. But as I'll tell you in a moment, keep your eye on this part of the supply chain. Tier 4 are the mill product, raw material suppliers, forging, casting. There's been a tremendous reduction of activity here and tremendous headcount. That's something to keep an eye on as we get ready to ramp up. Next slide. So when we start to ramp up production, as we've just shown you, and this is a notional slide, here's my message to you. The two bottlenecks in the supply chain will be human capital and working capital. Now, those small sub-tier suppliers I talked about, you know, if Airbus now says, hey, we want to go to 60 or 70 A320s a month, which is what they're signaling now. That means if you're a machine shop, you might need to engage in ordering long lead items, let's say a forging that might have a 1-year lead time, you know, to meet that ramp up. Well, you may not have the working capital to do that. And you may not have a purchase order in hand from Airbus or Boeing to do so. So there's a real standoff now where the aircraft OEMs are saying, we're going to get back to these production rates as fast as we can. And the supply chain, which has been really damaged, which doesn't have the working capital, many suppliers to execute this. The other issue is human capital. These small suppliers engaged in large-scale workforce reductions, just like many of you airlines did. And like you, they're having trouble attracting many of these suppliers to come back. Not to pick on any companies, but Precision Cast Parts, which is one of the largest suppliers of investment castings used in turbine blades and that sort of thing, laid off 50% of its workforce in the crisis. Howmet wasn't far behind. When we go now to ramp up, and the engine MRO market springs back, and we need those turbine blades and other parts for your overhauls, will the supply chain be ready for this with these smaller suppliers? And this is something to watch. And I know the engine OEMs are watching this very, very carefully as we go forward. Next slide. You know, a couple words about MRO, then we'll open it up to questions. You know, in the world of MRO, you know, and this is a pretty good cross section of airlines. It's no surprise China's done extremely well. In fact, they're spending a little bit more on MRO than before the crisis. Americas saw the big spring back led by the US, you know, and all these cargo aircraft, which kept MRO spending up, you know, relative to other regions. But then in APAC and Europe, which depends so much on international travel, you know, MRO spending is still less than 40% of what it was pre-COVID. Next slide. As we look forward, we think that MRO spending, airline MRO spending, will be up about 5 to 10% this year compared to last year. You know, 2020, the first quarter last year was very strong. So really last year, 2020, was about one strong quarter and a lot of maintenance spending by airlines, and then 3 really difficult quarters. This year is 4 challenging quarters. So we see a little bit of increase, 5 to 10%, but not wholesale increases, not a V-shaped spending recovery in maintenance. Okay, next slide. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to read all the bullets here, but what I'd say to you is that, you know, OEMs right now, I mean, we're entering an era, I think, where we're going to see, we have a lot of aircraft that are going to be headed for part out. I didn't really touch on that too much, where you, the airlines, are going to be looking to conserve your cash. You're going to be looking for flexible work scopes, which is why the IATA Rolls Royce agreement is so important. And you're going to be looking for suppliers that will work with you in giving you, in conserving cash and giving you that right balance that you are looking for. So for OEMs, they're going to have to really adapt to this environment for flexible work scopes, incorporation of used and serviceable material, DER repairs, and the like. I actually think it's going to be a very good period for independent MROs. Independent MROs have been losing market share for years. This is a period now with a lot of surplus aircraft that are going to be parted out, I think, where independents are actually going to do pretty well. They're going to have tailwinds, you know, in the short to medium term. In USM suppliers, right now, the use and serviceable material spending is very suppressed, of course, but that is going to increase, and we think you're going to see record numbers of aircraft part outs as MRO spending gets on track at the end of this crisis in 2024. And by the way, passenger to freighter conversions, it's incredible what's happening right now. There is a lot of capacity coming on market. We could see over 100 P2Fs a year running at record levels that we haven't seen before. And I think every day we wake up to new press releases on what's happening there. Finally, next slide. I just wanted to mention, and some of you may be aware of this, we do a customer satisfaction survey every year of the OEMs. How good of a job are the OEMs doing to meet your needs as IATA Airlines is what it's about. And it's meant to be independent. We've been doing it now for 3 years. You know, we did it last year. It wrapped up in March of last year. And CFM received the highest overall rating. And really what we're trying to do here is make this, we want this to be an industry standard where you, the airlines, have your voice heard about those OEMs that are supporting you and those that are not. Our participation last year was impacted by COVID, but we are getting ready to repeat that again this year. Next slide. And so we will be updating this again in January, February. And I mention this because I think Chris was kind enough to send an email to all of you in the MCC working group to encourage your airlines to participate. We very much hope that you'll participate this year and get your voice heard. You know, I'm showing you the responses we had. It was really cut a lot last year because of COVID. We'd like to get that back and above where it was in 2019. And we do send you a feedback report when you participate in this. And we're really looking at the 40 top OEMs that provide your equipment, your engines, your interiors, and your aircraft. So the contacts are listed here, and you'll see an email from Chris shortly. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Brilliant presentation as always. A lot of input. I think people are trying to digest what you've been presenting. Great presentation as we're waiting for this. I have some question for you, and it's about the environment and the sustainability that now it's becoming one of the most important forces now. Do you say now, how is this going to affect the big airframe manufacturers, the tier 1, tier 2s, the raw material, the whole supply chain? Are we going to shift from an aircraft life cycle of 25 years or so to shorter lifespans and have new models coming up faster? Can we keep up with certification? So a ton of questions around the environment.
ESG. So let me unpack this and try and be concise. So there's the aircraft development aspect of ESG, and really, hydrogen has become the the big hot item now, especially in Europe, as a solution for our industry to meet its emissions goals, and even the more ambitious goals being laid down in Europe for net zero emission. So my opinion is this: hydrogen as a solution to air transport emissions is several decades away. It isn't going to happen in 2035, like we've seen some press releases and some of the conceptual aircraft out there by aircraft OEMs, at least for 100 seats and above. There are enormous challenges in making hydrogen a workable solution for 100+ seat aircraft, which could be the subject of a whole nother webinar, and I won't get in, but it's many decades away. It could be used. We might see some developments in smaller commuter style aircraft and regional, where you might see hydrogen fuel cells. But again, 93% of the emissions, I believe, are from 100 seats and above. 7% are from regional aircraft and business jets and below, right? So that's where we need to operate, which means that in the short to medium term, sustainable aviation fuels are really the only major solution, along with working at improved air traffic management and airline operations and some other things that IATA does. So, Chris, I don't see, sometimes people ask me, well, can Boeing launch a new aircraft now because Airbus will leapfrog them with hydrogen? And my answer is no, that's not going to happen. There's plenty of room. We're going to have tube and wing, release another generation. But I think SAFs are the big thing. And you're now seeing the Biden administration in the US. They made an announcement last week, and they're trying to write, subsidies into the infrastructure bill in the U.S. to subsidize SAFs. And I think that's significant because, of course, Europe has been really at the leading edge of SAFs and embracing SAFs. Now the U.S., which has been on the sidelines in recent years, is now getting into the game. So on the product side, that's what I see. The other thing I'll mention as we're talking about production today is we're now seeing more focus on sustainability in the supply chain. And it's a different type of sustainability. It's about what's the carbon footprint of producing aircraft and engines and systems. And I think you're now starting to see OEMs look at the carbon footprint. Does it make sense to have a long global supply chain with parts being shipped all around the world, back and forth for processes in this continent, going to the next continent for final machining, that sort of thing? You're seeing more emphasis on that, and you're also seeing more emphasis on the reusability and recycling. Our industry on the whole does a very good job of recycling the metals at the end of life of aircraft. But during the production of aircraft right now, there is a lot of scrap and waste. There are 5 pounds of metal that end up on the shop floor for every pound that makes it on an aircraft. 5 pounds of scrap for every pound that makes it on an aircraft. Can we do a better job of capturing that scrap and recycling that into the aerospace industry? Right now, a lot of that scrap gets reused, but it goes to beer cans or maybe to the automotive industry. And I think there's going to be more focus on recycling that and being more efficient in the aerospace supply chain.
Thanks, Kevin. Actually, this leads to another question, and it's about 3D printing. So you mentioned that the technologies or the manufacturing that is used today is a lot of, let's call it subtractive. And now we have the additive manufacturing that doesn't induce that much waste. So do you see that coming up? Will we see production rates that, I think one of the limits of 3D printing is the rate that parts can be produced and the design and all that. But is there you think that we will see technology breakthroughs to make that more creeping into the manufacturing? What are the thoughts and what you have seen from your contacts in the industry?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's a great question. And so the bottom line is that the development of additive manufacturing in the supply chain for commercial jetliners, which is what we're talking about today, it's been disappointing. I mean, 3-4 years ago, the industry press had all kinds of pictures of, certain parts that are being printed, in engines, that sort of thing. But, Chris, here's the deal. The regulatory constraints have been far greater than anticipated, and the economic constraints, above all, haven't been there for most parts. So the economics and the regulators have been really slowing this down and holding it back, even though you're right that printing produces less scrap. We'll see incremental innovation here. Chris, where the big usage of additive manufacturing is in the parts of the aerospace industry that are not regulated. So let me be specific. Space isn't regulated by EASA or the FAA. You're seeing wide-scale use of additive in satellites and even in launchers, where a lot of the parts, for example, on the Falcon used by SpaceX, that infamous Falcon launcher, are printed. Experimental aircraft and those with a lighter regulatory touch. Unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, are using this. And in the defense, there's a lot of focus on using additive for sustainment to help with military aircraft, components that haven't been produced for 20 years, and you need those. So, Chris, it's just been a real challenge to bring this in. I'd say probably the best example of what can be done is a new engine called the Catalyst, made by GE, which is going to be used, I think, on the Denali, where you're going to have a large number of parts printed, but it requires a white sheet. We need new white sheet applications to bring more additive in. What's the next white sheet in the air transport sector? We don't have any right now, outside of maybe the A350 freighter. And again, you're going to be reusing a lot of the structure of the aircraft for that.
Great points, Kevin. Thanks. Excellent. I wasn't aware. I think many people were not aware that the space vehicles are using these technologies today. And do you see a role for IATA here to work with the with ICAO and the other regulators to promote and reduce that certification and that let's say conservatism that exists without getting into the safety concerns that they may have? Is there any way to approach especially the big regulators? I think this is an excellent point you're making there. But maybe there's a role for the whole industry, for all of us to play. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I think, the industry associations involved in these types of standards are organizations like SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, and others that are working on developing material databases and specifications. Because the challenge with additive is that the integrity of, the material properties of the part are a function of the material, the machine, and the manufacturing process, right? So you've got to build up these large databases to ensure the integrity. Whereas if you're just machining a big forging, those databases have been developed a long time ago. So what I might say, Chris, is that it might be worthwhile for IATA to engage with those associations that are in the middle of this, that are more manufacturing oriented, to understand the challenges and to determine where IATA members and supporters could bring their resources to bear on this right now. Because it is, a lot of this is about, it's not about lack of interest. It's about the technology and the material databases and things like that that are really getting in the way.
Yeah. Did you see this happening within our, we said 2035, but is it something that can happen within the next 5 years that can accelerate this? You think that
the hydrogen?
Is it realistic?
The hydrogen? Yeah.
No. I'm talking about the 3D printing here.
Oh, the 3D printing. Is
yes.
there something that could be done to accelerate it in the near term?
Yes.
I think the best thing to accelerate it is that Boeing and Airbus introduce new aircraft, honestly, because you can solve these problems, but if you don't have an application, what are you going to do? Which is why in the commuter, regional turboprop segment, where the Denali exists, this new Cessna aircraft, you've been able to roll this out, and it gives GE the chance to do a new centerline engine, right, to do this. It's why in UAVs right now, where you have multiple applications, and again, these are high mix, low quantity applications where additive can do very well, you're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff being done right now. But in the next 5 years, I think it's going to be challenging for the air transport sector to accelerate this, but I would encourage IATA to dig into this and understand where the bottlenecks are, on these challenges that I've highlighted, and there are others, but those are some of them.
Thank you very much for your input, Kevin. I don't want to spend more time on this. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So thank you so much for your great insights. I think people would appreciate your presentation, and everything will be provided to them at the end of our presentation today, of our webinar. So, and with this, I think we can come to a close here. And thanks again for your participation, your input, and some links for you. And again, you will receive the presentation. The agreement is posted already on our sites. And also, please do not forget to sign up for the next 2 episodes coming up in the next 2 Wednesdays. And I hope to see you there. We finished a little bit earlier today. We had a slightly lighter program, but the last 2 sessions are going to be, last 2 webinars were going to be full 2 hours, and in the topics that we have over there, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again for your participation, and you will receive also the links to the webinar and the presentation. Have a nice remaining of your day wherever you are. Bye-bye. And apologies for my problems with the camera today. Take care. Thank you.